The whisper reached Eleanor Hartley before the laughter did. There she is again, the plain spinster, come to watch someone else get married. Eleanor did not turn around. She had heard versions of that sentence for 15 years, spoken behind fans, behind gloved hands, behind polite smiles that never quite reached the eyes. Tonight it came from two young women near the punch table, girls who had not even been born the first time Eleanor stood at the edge of a ballroom and waited for a dance that never came. She kept her back straight and her gaze fixed on the dance floor, where her younger sister Charlotte spun in the arms of a baronet's son. Charlotte deserved this. Charlotte deserved music and candlelight and a future that did not depend on a stranger's mercy. Eleanor had come only to make sure of it. The Ashworth ballroom glittered with more candles than Eleanor had ever seen in one room. Chandeliers dripped light onto marble floors polished so bright they looked like still water. Eleanor stood near a pillar, a place she knew well, a place built for women who were meant to be looked past rather than looked at. She was 33 years old. She had stopped counting seasons after the 10th, though her mother still counted for her, usually with a sigh. Perhaps this year, her mother had said that morning, fastening the clasp of Eleanor's necklace with trembling fingers, perhaps someone will finally see you. Eleanor had not answered. She had learned long ago that hope was a luxury her family could no longer afford. Their estate at Hartwell was failing. The roof leaked over the east wing. The tenant farms brought in less each year. If Charlotte did not marry well, and soon, there would be nothing left to protect either of them. So Eleanor smiled when she was expected to smile, and she stayed silent when she was expected to disappear, and she told herself that watching Charlotte dance was enough. It was not enough, but it was what she had. The musicians shifted into a new piece, and the crowd near the entrance stirred. Eleanor glanced toward the doors out of habit, the same habit that had never once rewarded her with anything worth seeing. This time it did. A tall man entered the room, and every conversation near the doorway seemed to falter at once. He wore black, simple and unadorned, which made him stand out more than any amount of gold thread could have. His dark hair was cut shorter than fashion demanded. His expression carried the particular stillness of a man who had not smiled in a very long time, and did not intend to start tonight. The Duke of Ashworth, someone murmured behind Eleanor. Back from the continent at last. Eleanor had heard the name before, of course. Everyone had. Alexander Vane had inherited the title 10 years ago, after his father's sudden death, and had promptly left England to manage properties abroad, or so the story went. Some said he had left to escape grief. Others said he had left to escape a broken engagement no one spoke of directly. Whatever the truth, he had been a rumor for a decade, a name attached to an empty chair at every important event. Now the chair was filled, and the whole room seemed to lean toward him at once. Eleanor watched him the way she watched everything at these gatherings, from a careful distance, expecting nothing. She noticed the way he scanned the crowd without warmth, the way hostesses converged on him only to be met with brief, correct replies that ended conversations rather than opened them. She noticed, too, the exact moment his gaze crossed the room and landed, unexpectedly, on her. She looked away first. It was easier that way. Men did not look at Eleanor Hartley twice, and when they did, it was usually to confirm what they had already been told. The music ended. Charlotte returned to her side, cheeks flushed and eyes bright. "Did you see him?" Charlotte whispered. "The Duke? He is even more handsome than they say, and twice as cold." "I saw him," Eleanor said. "I am sure half the mothers in this room are already planning how to introduce their daughters." "Not you?" Eleanor gave her sister a small, tired smile. "I stopped planning that sort of thing a long time ago." Charlotte's face fell slightly, but before she could answer, a new voice interrupted them both. "Miss Hartley." Eleanor turned, expecting an acquaintance, expecting anyone but the man who now stood directly in front of her. Up close, the Duke of Ashworth was even more striking, and even more unreadable. His eyes were a deep gray, steady in a way that felt almost uncomfortable, as though he were reading something Eleanor had not intended to show. "Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully, dropping into a proper curtsy. Beside her, Charlotte had gone very still. "I do not believe we have been introduced," he said, "though I am told your name is Hartley." "Eleanor Hartley, Your Grace. This is my sister, Charlotte." He inclined his head toward Charlotte, brief and correct, then returned his attention to Eleanor, in a way that made her pulse stumble against her will. "Would you do me the honor of the next dance, Miss Hartley?" For a moment, Eleanor was certain she had misheard him. The orchestra was tuning for a new set. Around them, conversations had already begun to slow, heads turning with the particular hunger of people who sensed a story about to happen. "I beg your pardon?" she said. "The next dance," he repeated, unhurried. as though he had not just upended 15 years of her carefully constructed invisibility. "I would like to have it with you, if you are willing." Eleanor searched his face for the joke, for the flicker of amusement that would tell her this was some wager among bored young men, some cruel game dressed up as courtesy. She found none. His expression remained steady, patient, waiting for her answer as though it mattered to him. "I am willing," she said, because there was nothing else honest to say. He offered his arm. Eleanor took it, aware of every eye in the room following the movement, aware of the sudden hush that fell like a held breath. She had spent 15 years learning how to be unseen in this very room. Now, in the space of a single sentence, she had become the only thing anyone was looking at. The dance began. Alexander Vane moved with the same economy as everything else about him, nothing wasted, nothing performed for effect. He did not flatter her. He did not fill the silence with the empty compliments she had heard from every fortune hunter who had ever mistaken her for an easier target than her prettier younger sister. "You looked surprised," he said, halfway through the first turn. "I was," Eleanor admitted. There seemed little use in pretending otherwise. "Why?" "Because men in this room do not ask me to dance, Your Grace. Not unless they have lost a bet, or run out of other options." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close to one. "I have made neither mistake tonight." Eleanor did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing at all, and let the music carry them through the rest of the dance in a silence that felt, strangely, like the first honest conversation she'd had in a ballroom in years. When the dance ended, he bowed over her hand, thanked her with a formality that somehow did not feel cold, and returned her to Charlotte's side, before disappearing back into the crowd that had been watching them the entire time. The whispers began before Eleanor had even caught her breath. "Did you see that? The Duke, dancing with her? He must not know who she is. Someone ought to tell him. 15 years unmarried, and now this. It won't last the week." Eleanor kept her chin level and her expression calm, the way she always did, though something in her chest had loosened in a way she did not fully trust. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not fall for plain spinsters after a single dance, no matter what the storybooks claimed. There would be an explanation, ordinary and disappointing, waiting for her once the surprise wore off. Eleanor gripped her arm the moment they found a quiet corner. "Eleanor, do you understand what just happened?" "I danced with a duke," Eleanor said, keeping her voice light, though her hands were not entirely steady. "It happens to women every day." "Not to women like us," Charlotte said. "Not after 15 years of being told we were invisible. Mother will not believe it when I tell her." "Then perhaps you should not tell her." "Not yet. It was one dance, Charlotte. Nothing more." But even as she said it, Eleanor found herself watching the doorway where the Duke had disappeared, half expecting him to return, half hoping he would not, because hope was a dangerous thing to hold on to in a room full of people who had spent years teaching her not to. Their mother found them before the carriage ride home, her face bright with a hope Eleanor recognized and dreaded in equal measure. "They are already talking of nothing else," her mother said, fanning herself as though the excitement had left her breathless. "The Duke of Ashworth, dancing with my Eleanor. I never thought I would live to see it." "It was a single dance, Mother," Eleanor said. "Please do not build a wedding out of it before the carriage has even left the drive." "Of course not," her mother said, in a tone that suggested she was already doing exactly that. The ride home was long and quiet, the city lights giving way to dark countryside, and Eleanor sat with her forehead against the cool glass of the carriage window, replaying the dance in her mind despite every instruction she gave herself not to. She thought of his steady gray eyes, the way he had not once glanced away as though searching for someone more interesting to look at instead. She thought of the words he had chosen, careful and few, none of them wasted on flattery she would not have believed. She told herself it was curiosity on his part, nothing more. A new duke, recently returned, perhaps bored of the same practiced smiles offered by every eligible young woman in the room, drawn for one evening to something unfamiliar. It would pass. These things always did. And yet, when she closed her eyes that night in her small, cold bedroom at Hartwell, it was not the whispers she remembered, nor the laughter near the punch table, nor the 15 years of being looked past. It was the sound of her own name in his voice, steady and unhurried, as though he had already decided she was worth the saying of it. For the first time in a very long while, Eleanor Hartley fell asleep without bracing herself for disappointment in the morning. It did not last. It never did. But for one night it was enough to remember what it felt like to be seen, and to wonder, quietly and against her better judgment, whether it might happen again. By morning the story had already outrun the truth. Eleanor learned this the moment she stepped into the village shop to collect ribbon for her mother. and found 3 women fall silent as she entered. Their eyes followed her to the counter and back again, and she caught fragments of their whispered conversation before she reached the door. Desperate, they say, throwing herself at him. Poor man will realize his mistake soon enough. Eleanor did not slow her steps. She had spent 15 years learning how to walk through a room of whispers without letting her face show what they cost her, and she used every one of those years now, chin level, shoulders straight, until she reached the safety of the street outside. It should not have surprised her. A single dance with a duke was enough to set an entire county talking, and talk, Eleanor had learned long ago, was rarely kind to women who had spent too many years unmarried. She was accustomed to being overlooked. She was not accustomed to being discussed, and the difference unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She had nearly convinced herself the whole affair would fade within the week when a note arrived at Hartwell 3 days later, sealed with the Ashworth crest. Her mother nearly dropped the tray of tea in her excitement. "It is from him. Eleanor, open it." Eleanor's hands were steadier than she expected as she broke the seal. The message was brief, written in a firm, unhurried hand that matched the man she had danced with. "Miss Hartley, I find myself in need of company on my afternoon ride tomorrow, and poor conversation among my own thoughts. If you are willing to spare an hour, I would be glad of yours. No obligation attaches to the invitation beyond the ride itself. A. Vane, Duke of Ashworth." Eleanor read it twice, searching for the trick in it, the hidden barb, the joke at her expense that she was certain must be waiting somewhere in the careful phrasing. She found none. Just a plain request, offered without flourish, exactly as he had spoken to her at the ball. "You must go," her mother said, already reaching for pen and paper to draft a reply. "Mother, I have not even decided." "There is nothing to decide. A duke does not send notes to women he intends to forget." Eleanor was not so certain, but she agreed to the ride regardless, telling herself it was curiosity rather than hope that carried her decision. Hope had disappointed her too many times to be trusted so easily. The following afternoon, Alexander arrived at Hartwell astride a tall bay horse, dressed as plainly as he had been at the ball, and greeted Eleanor with the same steady courtesy she remembered. They rode along the lane that bordered the estate's failing eastern fields, and for a long while neither spoke, the silence comfortable in a way Eleanor had not expected. "Your land needs attention," he said eventually, nodding toward the fallow field beside them. "My land needs money," Eleanor said, before she could stop herself. It was not the sort of thing one admitted to a duke on a first ride, but something about his directness invited an equal honesty in return. "We have neither the funds nor the labor to restore it properly. My father died believing the estate would recover on its own. It has not. Many estates share that trouble," Alexander said, without pity in his voice, which Eleanor appreciated more than she could easily explain. It is not a failing to admit it. Most men would think it a very great failing indeed, in a family they were considering. "I am not most men." Eleanor glanced at him, searching again for the joke, the flattery, the angle she had learned to expect from any man who paid her attention. She found instead the same stillness she had noticed at the ball, a man who seemed to say only what he meant and nothing more. "Why did you ask me to dance?" she asked, because the question had followed her for 3 days and she was tired of carrying it alone. "You could have chosen anyone in that room." Alexander was quiet for a moment, guiding his horse around a fallen branch before he answered. "Because everyone else in that room was performing. You were not. I have spent 10 years surrounded by people who wanted something from me, Miss Hartley. It was strange, and rather welcome, to meet someone who clearly wanted nothing at all." "I wanted to be left alone," Eleanor said honestly. "That was the whole of it. I noticed. It made you the only interesting person in the room." Despite herself, Eleanor laughed, a short, surprised sound she had not planned to let escape. Alexander's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close enough that she felt something in her chest loosen at the sight of it. The ride continued another half hour, conversation drifting between the state of the tenant farms, Alexander's years abroad managing properties in Portugal and Spain, and Charlotte's hopeful nature, which Eleanor described with more warmth than she usually allowed herself to show a near stranger. By the time they returned to Hartwell, something had shifted between them, subtle but undeniable, a thread of understanding neither had expected to find. Word of the ride reached the village before Eleanor had even changed out of her riding clothes. Her mother met her at the door, delighted. Her father's old steward, a kind man named Henry, offered a quiet nod of approval when he saw her return with color in her cheeks. But not everyone greeted the news so warmly. That evening, at a small supper hosted by the Pemberton family, Eleanor felt the shift in the room the moment she entered. Conversations paused. A cluster of women near the fireplace exchanged glances sharp enough to cut. "Miss Hartley," said Lady Pemberton's daughter, a young woman named Margaret with a smile too bright to be kind. "We hear you have been keeping remarkable company lately." "I went riding with a friend," Eleanor said evenly. "A friend," Margaret repeated, as though tasting the word for irony. "How fortunate for you, to have friends in such high places, after so many years without any at all." The room did not laugh outright, but Eleanor felt the amusement all the same, hidden behind raised teacups and lowered eyes. She had endured worse over the years, sharper words delivered with gentler smiles, and she had always managed to let them pass without visible injury. Tonight, for reasons she did not fully understand, the words landed harder than usual. "I do not believe my company is any concern of yours, Miss Pemberton," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level, though her hands had curled slightly at her sides. "But I thank you for your interest all the same." She left the gathering earlier than planned, and Charlotte found her afterward in the carriage, quiet and pale in the dim lantern light. "You should not let them speak to you that way," Charlotte said fiercely. "Not anymore, not now that things are changing." "Nothing has changed, Charlotte," Eleanor said softly. "One ride does not undo 15 years. I would be foolish to believe otherwise." But 2 days later, another note arrived, and then a third the week after, each one plain and unhurried, each one asking for nothing more than an hour of her company. Alexander called on her at Hartwell twice more before the month was out, walking the gardens with her, asking after Charlotte's happiness and her mother's health with a sincerity that slowly, carefully, began to ease something guarded in Eleanor's chest that she had not realized was still capable of easing. She told herself repeatedly that it meant nothing lasting. Dukes did not marry plain spinsters with failing estates, no matter how pleasant an afternoon ride might be. But each time he left, she found herself watching the lane long after his horse had disappeared from view, waiting for something she was afraid to name even to herself. It was during his 4th visit that Eleanor first noticed the other rider watching from the tree line at the edge of the property, a man on a dark horse who did not approach, who simply observed for several long minutes before turning away. She thought little of it at the time, assuming him a neighbor or a steward from a nearby estate. She would come to understand, before long, that she had been wrong to dismiss him so easily. The man watching from the trees was Frederick Vane, cousin to the Duke of Ashworth and next in line for the title, should Alexander never marry. And his interest in Eleanor Hartley was anything but idle curiosity. Frederick had spent 10 years believing the dukedom would eventually fall to him. Alexander's long absence abroad, his refusal to marry, his apparent disinterest in society, had all suggested a man content to let the title pass quietly to his cousin when the time came. Frederick had built a comfortable life on that assumption, spending freely against an inheritance he considered as good as settled. A sudden courtship, however unlikely its object, threatened everything he had planned. He mentioned none of this to Eleanor when he finally approached her directly. A week after his silent watching from the tree line, she was walking alone near the edge of the Hartwell Gardens when he appeared, dismounting his horse with an easy smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Miss Hartley," he said, bowing with practiced charm, "forgive the intrusion. I am Frederick Vane, cousin to the Duke. I confess I have heard a great deal about you recently." "I imagine you have," Eleanor said carefully, unsure yet what to make of him. "All of it admiring, I assure you," Frederick said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "My cousin has always been difficult to please. It says a great deal about you, that he has taken such an interest. We have gone riding together a few times. I would not call it an interest, Mr. Vane." "Of course not," Frederick said, smiling in a way that made Eleanor faintly uneasy, though she could not have said exactly why. "Though I wonder, Miss Hartley, whether you have considered what such attention might cost you, should it prove as brief as these things often are. My cousin has a habit of losing interest quickly. It would be a shame to see you hurt by it." "I appreciate your concern," Eleanor said, though she did not believe for a moment that concern was truly what motivated him. "But I am quite capable of managing my own expectations, Mr. Vane." He left soon after, offering pleasant farewells that did nothing to ease the unease he had planted. Eleanor did not mention the conversation to Alexander when he called 2 days later, telling herself it was not worth repeating, though she found herself watching the tree line more carefully after that, half expecting to see the dark horse again. The garden visit that followed was warmer than any before it. Alexander arrived without notice, which had become something of a habit between them, and found Eleanor kneeling in the small flower bed she tended herself, since Hartwell could no longer afford a proper gardener. "You do this yourself?" he asked, watching her work with an expression she could not quite read. "Someone must," Eleanor said, brushing dirt from her hands as she rose. "It is one of the few things at Hartwell still worth tending." "It shows," Alexander said, glancing at the small, carefully ordered bed of late summer flowers, a rare bright spot against the otherwise fading grandeur of the estate. Most women of your station would consider this beneath them. Most women of my station have not spent 15 years learning that pride does not fill an empty larder, your grace. Eleanor regretted the words the moment they left her mouth, too honest, too unguarded for a duke's company. But Alexander did not flinch from them the way she expected. I find I prefer your honesty to their pride, he said quietly. It is a rare thing, Miss Hartley, to meet someone who has not learned to perform contentment they do not feel. They walked the garden path together after that, and Eleanor found herself telling him things she had not intended to share, about her father's death and the debts he had left unspoken, about the suitor who had once asked for her hand only to vanish weeks before the wedding when a wealthier prospect appeared, about the particular loneliness of being the eldest daughter in a family that needed saving and having no way to save it. Alexander listened without interrupting, without the polite sympathy she had grown so tired of receiving from others. Sympathy that always seemed more concerned with filling silence than truly hearing what was said. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I am sorry, he said finally. Not for you, though I am sorry for what you endured. I am sorry for every person in that ballroom who looked at you for 15 years and saw nothing worth their attention. They were fools, every one of them. Eleanor did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and they finished the walk in a silence that felt, once again, like the truest conversation she had shared with anyone in a very long time. It was Charlotte who noticed the change first, the way Eleanor's shoulders had begun to soften, the way she smiled now without first checking whether the room deserved it. Charlotte said nothing of it directly, but she began finding reasons to leave Eleanor and Alexander alone during his visits, a small kindness Eleanor recognized and quietly appreciated. Not everyone showed such kindness. The whispers in the village had not faded as Eleanor hoped they might. If anything, they had sharpened, fed by each new visit from the Duke's carriage, each new sighting of Eleanor's altered mood. At church the following Sunday, an older woman Eleanor barely knew stopped her outside the doors with a look of thin, performed sympathy. You must be careful, Miss Hartley, the woman said. Men like the Duke enjoy a novelty for a season. It rarely lasts beyond that. I would hate to see you disappointed again, after everything you have already endured. Eleanor thanked her for the concern with a composure that cost her more than she let show, and walked home turning the woman's words over in her mind, despite every effort not to. She was no stranger to disappointment. She had built her entire adult life around expecting it, around refusing to hope too loudly in case hope was the very thing that invited ruin. And yet when Alexander's carriage appeared at the end of the lane 2 days later, precisely when he had promised it would, Eleanor felt something in her chest lift despite every warning she had given herself. And she went to meet him without hesitation, no longer entirely certain she wanted to guard her heart as carefully as she once had. The letter arrived without warning, slipped beneath the door of Eleanor's bedroom sometime in the night, unsigned and written in a hand she did not recognize. He remembers her too, the one who left him waiting at the altar years ago. Ask him why he truly returned from the continent, Miss Hartley, before you give your heart to a man who has already broken one. Eleanor read it twice by candlelight, her hands unsteady in a way they had not been since the whispers first began. She had heard the rumors, of course, distant and unconfirmed, that Alexander's decade abroad had followed some private sorrow, but he had never spoken of it directly, and she had not pressed him, respecting the same privacy she guarded so fiercely herself. Now the words sat heavy in her chest, stirring a fear she had thought long buried. She knew what it was to be left waiting. 8 years ago, before her father's death, she had accepted a proposal from a young landowner named Edmund Fairfax, a quiet man with modest prospects who had seemed, for a brief golden season, to see her exactly as she was and want her anyway. 3 weeks before their wedding, he had broken the engagement in a single cold letter, having found a wealthier match with a merchant's daughter from Bristol. Eleanor had never fully spoken of the humiliation that followed, the pity in every eye at church, the quiet cruelty of neighbors who found her abandonment more interesting than her grief. She had promised herself, in the long months after, that she would never again allow herself to be so thoroughly undone by another person's choices. She had built her heart into something careful and armored, and in the space of a few short weeks, Alexander Vane had somehow found his way past every wall she had constructed. Now an anonymous letter threatened to remind her exactly why those walls existed in the first place. She did not sleep that night. By morning she had decided, with the particular grim resolve of a woman who had survived one heartbreak and had no intention of walking blindly into another, that she would ask him directly, whatever the cost to the fragile ease that had grown between them. Alexander arrived at Hartwell that afternoon as scheduled, and Eleanor met him in the small parlor rather than the garden, needing the solidity of walls around her for what she intended to say. "You look troubled," he said immediately, setting aside his hat. "What has happened?" Eleanor did not soften the question. "Is it true that you were once engaged, Your Grace, and that the engagement ended badly enough to send you away from England for 10 years? Something shifted behind his eyes, not anger, but a weariness that told her the letter had not lied about this much at least. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered. "Yes," he said simply. "It is true." Eleanor's chest tightened despite her resolve to remain composed. "Why did you never tell me?" "Because it is not a story I share easily, and because I did not believe, when we first began writing together, that it would matter enough to require the telling." He sat across from her, his expression careful, deliberate, the same stillness she had come to recognize as his way of choosing words with great care. "Her name was Margaret Ellsworth. We were engaged when I was 24, before my father's death, before the title fell to me. She was kind and clever, and I believed myself fortunate. 3 months before our wedding, she died of a fever that swept through her family's household. I was not left waiting at any altar, Miss Hartley. I was left grieving someone I had already begun building a life around, and I did not know how to remain in England afterward, surrounded by every place we had planned to share." Eleanor's anger, so carefully prepared, dissolved into something far more complicated. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "The letter I received suggested something else entirely, something crueler." Alexander's expression sharpened. "What letter?" Eleanor retrieved it from where she had tucked it into her sleeve and handed it across, watching his face as he read the unsigned lines. His jaw tightened visibly, the stillness she had grown used to giving way, for the first time since she had known him, to something closer to controlled anger. "This is a lie," he said, "crafted by someone who knows enough of the truth to twist it convincingly. Margaret did not leave me at an altar, Miss Hartley. She died. Whoever wrote this either does not know the difference or does not care, so long as the doubt takes root." "Who would want to plant such doubt?" Eleanor asked, though even as she spoke the question, an uneasy thought was already forming, one she did not want to voice aloud. Alexander's silence lasted a moment too long. "I have a cousin," he said finally, "who stands to inherit the dukedom should I never marry, or should any match I make fail badly enough to sour my reputation beyond repair. Frederick has visited you, I believe." Eleanor's stomach turned cold. "Once, he offered concern for my feelings, nothing more." "Frederick's concern rarely comes without a purpose behind it," Alexander said grimly. "I should have warned you sooner. I did not wish to burden you with family troubles before they became necessary to share." Eleanor sat with this new understanding for a long moment, turning it over against everything Frederick had said during his single visit, his warnings about attention that would not last, his careful planting of doubt disguised as friendly caution. It fit too well to be coincidence. "I do not know whether to be angry with you for not warning me, or with him for what he has already done," Eleanor admitted. "Be angry with him," Alexander said. "I will manage my own regrets." The conversation eased something between them, but it did not erase the unease the letter had stirred. That evening, after Alexander had gone, Eleanor sat with Charlotte in the small sitting room, and finally told her sister everything: the letter, Frederick's visit, Alexander's grief for a woman named Margaret Ellsworth who had died rather than abandoned him. "It sounds as though someone wants to frighten you away," Charlotte said, frowning. "Someone who understands exactly which fears would work best." "I fear that is precisely what is happening," Eleanor admitted. The following week brought no further letters, but the whispers in the village grew stranger, more specific, as though someone were feeding them fresh material with careful regularity. Eleanor heard, second-hand through a nervous shopkeeper's wife, that she had been seen alone with the Duke under circumstances no respectable woman would permit. She heard, from a cousin of the Pembertons, that her family's debts were far worse than anyone had previously believed, and that she had set her sights on Alexander purely to save Hartwell from ruin. Some of it was cruelly close to the truth, twisted just enough to sound damning rather than simply desperate. Eleanor began to suspect that whoever spread these rumors knew her circumstances too intimately for a stranger, knew details that only someone watching closely, perhaps from the tree line at the edge of her own gardens, could have gathered. She raised her suspicion with Alexander during his next visit, walking the garden path that had become, over the past weeks, the quiet center of whatever understanding was growing between them. "Frederick has always been resourceful," Alexander said, his voice tight with restrained frustration. "He has spent years assuming this inheritance would fall to him uncontested. He will not surrender that assumption easily." "What will he do next, do you think?" "I do not know," Alexander admitted, "but I intend to be prepared for it, whatever it is." Eleanor appreciated his resolve, though it did little to ease the anxious weight that had settled over her since the letter arrived. She had spent 15 years building a life around low expectations, precisely because hope, once disappointed, left wounds that took years to close. Now she found herself caring for a man whose family harbored an enemy, determined to see her ruined rather than married. And the fear of losing something she had only just allowed herself to want pressed harder against her chest than any 15 years of quiet invisibility ever had. That fear sharpened considerably 2 weeks later, when Frederick appeared once more at Hartwell, this time not lingering at the tree line but riding directly to the front entrance, uninvited and unannounced. Eleanor received him in the small parlor out of necessity rather than welcome, Charlotte hovering nearby with poorly concealed suspicion. "Miss Hartley," Frederick said, all easy charm as he settled into the chair across from her. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I find myself concerned for your welfare, given the direction certain rumors have taken." "I am aware of the rumors, Mr. Vane," Eleanor said evenly. "I am also aware that you have visited me once before with similar concerns, shortly before those rumors began." Something flickered across Frederick's face, gone too quickly to be certain of its meaning, though Eleanor thought it might have been surprised that she had connected the timing so directly. "I assure you, Miss Hartley, I have no part in whatever gossip the village chooses to entertain itself with. I came only to warn you, as a friend, that my cousin's affections have historically proven short-lived. I would hate to see you invest your heart, and your family's remaining reputation, in a match that will not survive the season." "Your concern is noted," Eleanor said, rising to signal the visit's end. "But I find I trust your cousin's word considerably more than I trust yours, Mr. Vane, and I would ask that you not call again without invitation." Frederick's smile thinned, the charm slipping just enough to reveal something colder beneath it. "As you wish, Miss Hartley. I only hope you will remember this conversation. When the season ends and my cousin's interest inevitably moves on to someone new." He left without further pleasantries, and Eleanor stood at the parlor window watching his horse disappear down the lane, an uneasy certainty settling over her that Frederick Vane had not come to warn her at all. He had come to threaten her, quietly enough that she could not prove it, and clearly enough that she understood exactly what she was up against. She wrote to Alexander that same evening, describing the visit in full, and his reply arrived the following morning, brief and resolute. "I will handle Frederick. In the meantime, know that nothing he says or does will change what I feel for you. I only ask that you trust me a little longer, while I gather what proof I can of his interference. You are not alone in this, Eleanor, whatever the village chooses to whisper." It was the first time he had written her given name rather than her formal title, and Eleanor read the single word again and again, before finally setting the letter aside, a small, stubborn warmth pushing back against the fear Frederick had worked so carefully to plant. She did not yet know what proof Alexander intended to find, nor how far his cousin was willing to go to protect an inheritance he had spent a decade assuming was his. But she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was no longer willing to retreat quietly into the invisibility she had spent 15 years perfecting, not for Frederick, and not for anyone else who believed her too plain, too poor, or too easily frightened to fight for what she had finally allowed herself to want. The test of that resolve came sooner than she expected, at a supper party hosted by Lord and Lady Amherst the following week, an event Eleanor had nearly declined until Charlotte insisted that hiding at Hartwell would only feed the rumors further. "If you stay away, they will say it is because the whispers are true," Charlotte reasoned, fastening the clasp of Eleanor's simplest good gown. "If you attend, and hold your head high, they will have nothing left to say at all." Eleanor was not entirely convinced, but she went regardless, and the moment she entered the Amherst drawing room, she understood Charlotte had been right to worry. The usual polite murmur of conversation faltered as she crossed the threshold, replaced by the particular hush that had followed her through 15 years of ballrooms, though this time it carried a sharper edge, curious rather than merely dismissive. Lady Amherst greeted her with brittle courtesy, and several of the older women present exchanged glances Eleanor had learned long ago to recognize as the opening moves of a conversation designed to wound. "Miss Hartley," said Mrs. Colby, a woman Eleanor barely knew but who had apparently heard a great deal about her regardless. "We were just remarking how surprising it is, the company you have been keeping. One does wonder what a man of the Duke's standing could possibly see in a match so far beneath his usual circles." The room did not laugh, but the silence that followed carried the same weight, several pairs of eyes turning toward Eleanor with open curiosity, waiting to see whether she would crumble the way, perhaps. They expected a woman with 15 quiet years behind her to crumble. Eleanor did not crumble. "I imagine he sees a woman who does not require flattery to feel valued, Mrs. Colby," she said, her voice steady and unhurried, borrowing, without entirely meaning to, some of Alexander's own careful stillness. It is a rarer quality than you might think, in rooms such as this one. A few surprised laughs rippled through the gathering, not unkind ones, and Mrs. Colby's composure faltered just slightly before she recovered with a thin smile and turned the conversation elsewhere. Charlotte, standing nearby, caught Eleanor's eye with unmistakable pride. The evening might have ended there, a small victory quietly won, had Frederick not arrived an hour later, unexpected and clearly uninvited by the Amhersts themselves, judging by their startled greeting at the door. He moved through the room with practiced ease, charming and unbothered, until he found his way to the small circle where Eleanor stood with Charlotte and a few of the kinder guests she had begun, slowly, to consider something like friends. "Miss Hartley," Frederick said, bowing with exaggerated courtesy. "How well you look this evening, given everything you must be enduring." "I am enduring nothing I cannot manage, Mr. Vane," Eleanor said evenly. "Of course not," he said, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Though I confess I worry, hearing the things people say. About your family's circumstances, about how very convenient a match with my cousin would prove, for an estate so deeply in debt." The words landed exactly as he intended them to, sharp and public, spoken loudly enough for the nearby guests to hear clearly. Eleanor felt heat rise in her face, not from shame but from anger, a slow-burning fury at watching him weaponize her family's private struggles in front of a room full of strangers, who would carry the story to every drawing room in the county by morning. "My family's circumstances are not a subject for this gathering, Mr. Vane," she said, keeping her voice low and controlled despite the fury building beneath it. "Nor are they any business of yours." "They become everyone's business," Frederick said softly, leaning slightly closer, "when they threaten to attach themselves to a title as old as Ashworth. I only wish to see my cousin protected from a mistake he may not fully understand he is making." Before Eleanor could answer, a new voice cut through the small circle. Calm but carrying an edge of steel, Eleanor had not yet heard from him. "I understand my own decisions perfectly well, Frederick." Alexander had arrived without her noticing, and now stood directly behind his cousin, his expression composed but his eyes carrying a warning that even Frederick seemed to register. The nearby guests fell silent, sensing, correctly, that they were witnessing something far more significant than ordinary supper conversation. "Alexander," Frederick said, recovering quickly, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. "I was merely expressing concern for Miss Hartley's welfare." "You were expressing concern for your inheritance," Alexander said, quiet enough that only their small circle could hear, though the words carried a finality that ended the conversation entirely. "I would ask you not to trouble Miss Hartley again, in public or in private. This is the last time I intend to make that request politely." Frederick's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, offering a stiff bow before withdrawing into the wider crowd, leaving behind a silence that felt, to Eleanor, like the first crack in whatever careful campaign he had been building against her. Alexander turned to her once his cousin had gone, his expression softening considerably. "I am sorry you were made to endure that." "I managed well enough," Eleanor said, though she was grateful, more than she wanted to admit, for his arrival. "Your cousin is very determined." "He is," Alexander agreed grimly, "which is precisely why I do not intend to let him succeed." They did not speak further of Frederick that evening, but as Eleanor rode home beside Charlotte in the quiet carriage, watching the dark countryside pass beyond the window, she understood that whatever fragile peace had existed between herself and Frederick Vane had ended entirely at the Amherst supper. He would not stop simply because Alexander had warned him once. Men who believed an inheritance rightfully theirs rarely surrendered it so easily, and Eleanor suspected, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her chest, that his next attempt would be considerably less public and considerably more dangerous than anything he had yet dared to try. The letter appeared in every drawing room in the county within 3 days, though no one could say precisely how it had spread so quickly. Eleanor heard of it first from Charlotte, who arrived home from a visit to the Pembertons pale and shaking, clutching a folded copy pressed into her hands by a sympathetic neighbor who thought Charlotte ought to know before the whole village had already formed its opinion. "Read it," Charlotte said, thrusting the paper toward her sister. "Eleanor, you must read it now." Eleanor unfolded the page with a growing sense of dread, and found, written in a hand that closely resembled her own careful script, though she had never penned a single word of it, a letter addressed to an unnamed friend in London. "I confess I have set my sights firmly on the Duke, and though he is dull company at best, his fortune will more than compensate for the tedium. Hartwell cannot survive another season without new funds, and a plain woman of my circumstances cannot afford to be particular about the source. Charlotte thinks me foolish for pursuing him so openly, but foolishness matters little when the alternative is ruin. Eleanor read it twice, then a third time, her hands trembling with a fury she had rarely allowed herself to feel so completely. Every cruel assumption whispered about her for weeks had now been given false confirmation in her own supposed words, twisted just enough to sound plausible, cruel enough to destroy whatever fragile respectability she had managed to rebuild. "This is not my hand," Eleanor said, though her voice shook despite her effort to keep it steady. "I never wrote this. I would never write this." "I know," Charlotte said fiercely. "But Eleanor, everyone in the county has already read it. They believe it." Mrs. Colby was reciting it aloud at the Pembertons as though it were scripture. Eleanor sat heavily in the nearest chair, the paper still clutched in her hand, and for the first time since Frederick had first appeared at the edge of her gardens, she felt something close to despair settle over her. She had survived 15 years of quiet dismissal by building walls thick enough that whispers could not reach the parts of her that mattered. This was different. This was not dismissal but destruction, a deliberate attempt to take the one thing she had allowed herself to hope for, and burn it to nothing in front of everyone who had ever doubted her. She did not have to wonder long who had crafted it. The handwriting was close enough to fool a casual glance, close enough that someone must have studied a genuine sample of her writing carefully before attempting the forgery, and Eleanor could think of only one person with both the motive and the opportunity to have done so. Alexander arrived at Hartwell within the hour, having heard the news himself from an agitated servant, and found Eleanor still seated in the small parlor, the forged letter spread on the table before her. "I know it is false," he said immediately, before she could even speak. "I would know your hand anywhere by now, Eleanor, and this is not it, but I fear the damage is already considerable." "Considerable," Eleanor repeated, a bitter edge creeping into her voice she could not fully suppress. "Your Grace, by tomorrow every household in the county will believe I pursued you for your fortune alone, believe I called my own sister foolish for questioning it, believe every unkind thing they have ever suspected of me is now proven true in my own words. I do not know that considerable begins to describe it." "Then we will prove it false," Alexander said, his voice firm despite the weariness Eleanor could see building behind his eyes. "I will not let Frederick destroy your reputation to protect his inheritance. I promise you that." Eleanor wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his resolve would be enough against a rumor already loose in the world and multiplying with every retelling. But 15 years of disappointment had taught her that promises, however sincerely offered, rarely survived contact with circumstances determined to prove them wrong. "You cannot control what people choose to believe," she said quietly. "I learned that lesson long before you returned from the continent, Your Grace. Once a story takes hold, the truth rarely catches it in time. Then we will make certain the truth moves faster," Alexander said. "There is a gathering at the Ashworth estate this weekend, one I had already planned before this letter appeared. I intend to use it." Eleanor's stomach tightened at the thought of facing the full weight of county society so soon after the forged letter had spread. "Use it how?" "By telling them the truth myself, in front of everyone who has read that letter and believed it," Alexander said. "I will not let you carry this alone, Eleanor. Whatever comes of Saturday, you will not stand in that room by yourself." The days leading up to the gathering passed slowly, each one marked by fresh evidence of the letter's reach. Eleanor's mother wept quietly over the ruin of a reputation she had spent 33 years helping her daughter protect. Charlotte fielded a stream of visitors whose sympathy barely disguised their eagerness to witness the family's humiliation firsthand. Even Henry, the old steward who had always shown Eleanor nothing but kindness, grew quiet and careful around her, as though uncertain how to address a scandal he did not fully understand. Eleanor spent those days in a state of controlled misery, appearing calm before her family, while privately certain that whatever Alexander intended to do at the gathering would not be enough to undo what Frederick had so carefully constructed. She had seen reputations destroyed before, watched other women's names become permanent jokes over far smaller offenses than the one now attached to hers, however falsely. Saturday arrived cold and overcast, matching Eleanor's mood as the Hartwell carriage made its way toward Ashworth Hall. The estate's ballroom, so different from the warm glow she remembered from their first meeting, felt colder now, filled with guests who watched her arrival with open curiosity, rather than the usual polite indifference she had grown accustomed to over the years. Whispers followed her the moment she entered, sharper and less carefully hidden than any she had endured before. She caught fragments as she crossed the room toward where her mother and Charlotte waited near the refreshment table, her chin held level despite the effort it cost her. Knew it was only ever about the money. Poor Duke, so easily fooled by a clever woman. Surprised she had the nerve to show her face here at all. Eleanor endured it for nearly an hour, moving carefully through the edges of the gathering the way she had learned to do so many years ago, before Alexander finally called for the room's attention, standing near the head of the grand staircase where every guest could see him clearly. "I would like a moment of your attention," he said, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "I understand a letter has been circulating this week, purportedly written by Miss Eleanor Hartley, describing her intentions toward me in terms I know, without any doubt, she never wrote." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt every eye in the room shift toward her, and she forced herself to stand steady beneath the weight of it, refusing to shrink the way 15 years of practice urged her to do. "I have known Miss Hartley for several months now," Alexander continued. "I have watched her tend her own garden because her family cannot afford a gardener, watched her carry the weight of an estate no one else in her family could manage, watched her endure years of cruelty from people who mistook her quiet dignity for something to mock rather than admire. Whoever forged that letter understood her circumstances well enough to make the lie convincing, but they understood nothing of her character at all." He paused, letting the words settle over the silent room before continuing. "I intend to marry Eleanor Hartley, should she still have me after the treatment she has endured this week at the hands of people in this very room. Her fortune, or lack of it, has never once entered my consideration. I would ask that anyone still inclined to repeat that letter's contents consider carefully whether they wish to be remembered as someone who helped spread a lie, or someone who had the decency to stop it." The ballroom remained silent for a long, suspended moment. Eleanor stood frozen, aware of her mother's soft gasp beside her, aware of Charlotte gripping her hand tightly, aware most of all of Alexander's steady gaze finding hers across the crowded room, unwavering despite everything the last week had thrown against them both. Someone began to clap, hesitantly at first, and then others joined, though Eleanor suspected not all of it came from genuine sympathy rather than simple relief at having something dramatic to discuss over breakfast the following morning. She did not care. For the first time in 15 years she had watched someone stand in the center of a crowded room and choose her, publicly and without hesitation, against every cruel assumption that room had ever made. Later that evening, in a quiet corner of the Ashworth Gardens where the noise of the gathering could not follow them, Alexander found her standing alone beneath the dim glow of a lantern. "You did not have to say all of that," Eleanor said softly when he joined her. "In front of everyone." "I meant every word of it," Alexander said. "Though I confess, I had not intended to propose marriage quite so publicly. I had rather hoped to ask you properly first." Despite everything the week had cost her, Eleanor found herself almost smiling. "You have a curious sense of timing, Your Grace. I have spent 10 years avoiding attachments precisely because I feared losing someone the way I lost Margaret," Alexander said, his voice quieter now, more uncertain than Eleanor had ever heard it. "But watching that letter nearly destroy you this week, watching how easily people believed the worst simply because they had never bothered to know you at all, I found I could not stay silent any longer. I do not know how to promise you a life without difficulty, Eleanor. Frederick has not finished, I am certain of that. But I can promise you will not face it alone, if you are willing to have me." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, weighing 15 years of caution against the steady certainty in his eyes, and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the fear did not win. "I am willing," she said quietly, echoing the words she had spoken at their very first dance, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. "But I would ask you one thing first, Your Grace. I would ask that we find proof of what Frederick has done, before this becomes anything more than an understanding between us. I have spent enough of my life defending myself against lies. I would like for once to see the truth proven beyond any doubt at all." "Then we will find it," Alexander said, taking her hand in the quiet dark of the garden. Together. They stood a while longer in the cool evening air, the distant sound of the gathering still drifting from the ballroom behind them, and Eleanor found herself telling him, quietly and without the guard she usually kept around such memories, exactly how the week had felt from inside it. "I kept waiting for you to change your mind," she admitted. "Not because I doubted your character, but because I have watched circumstances change kinder men than you before. Edmund did not stop loving me because his heart failed him. He stopped because a wealthier option appeared, and made the choice easier than loyalty. I have spent 8 years assuming the same pattern would repeat itself, sooner or later, with anyone who showed me real affection. I am not Edmund," Alexander said, his voice steady, "and Frederick's letter was not a wealthier option appearing to tempt me away. It was an attack, meant to frighten you and shame me into distancing myself from the scandal. I understood that the moment I read it. I only regret that it took me a full day to gather the resolve to speak as plainly as I should have from the start." "You spoke plainly enough tonight," Eleanor said. I do not think anyone in that ballroom will forget it soon. Good, Alexander said, something almost fierce in his tone. I have spent too many years letting silence protect me from difficult attachments. I find I no longer wish to be protected in that particular way. They returned to the ballroom separately, as propriety demanded, though Eleanor noticed the room's mood had shifted considerably in their absence. Mrs. Colby, who had so eagerly recited the forged letter days earlier, now avoided Eleanor's eye entirely, suddenly absorbed in a conversation near the far window. Lady Amherst approached instead, offering an apology so stiff and reluctant that Eleanor suspected it cost her considerable pride to deliver. I hope you understand, Miss Hartley, Lady Amherst said, that none of us truly believed such things of you. It was simply difficult, given how convincingly the letter was written, to know what to think. Eleanor accepted the apology with more grace than she felt inclined to offer, understanding that the coming weeks would bring more of the same, cautious retreats from people who had been eager enough to condemn her days earlier, and would now scramble to claim they had never truly doubted her at all. It was not forgiveness, not exactly, but it was something, and after the week she had endured, Eleanor found she had little energy left to demand more than that. Charlotte found her near the carriage as the evening finally drew to a close, her eyes still bright with the particular fierce pride she had shown since the letter first appeared. "Did you hear what they were saying at the end?" Charlotte asked. "Half the room is already calling it the most romantic thing anyone has witnessed in years. The Duke, defending you in front of everyone. I told you, Eleanor. I told you things were changing." "They are changing," Eleanor agreed, though the words carried more weight than simple agreement. "But Charlotte, we still do not know how Frederick managed the forgery, nor what he intends to do next, now that his first attempt has failed so publicly. I would not celebrate too soon." Charlotte's excitement dimmed slightly at the reminder, but she squeezed her sister's hand regardless. "Whatever comes next, you will not face it the way you faced everything before. That much has already changed, and no letter, forged or otherwise, can undo it." Eleanor held on to those words during the quiet carriage ride home, watching the dark countryside pass beyond the window much as she had after that very first ball, though everything about the journey felt different now. She was no longer riding home wondering whether a single dance had meant anything at all. She was riding home as a woman who had been chosen, publicly and deliberately, by a man who understood exactly what he was choosing, and had chosen it regardless of the cost. It was not victory, not yet. Frederick remained free, his scheme merely delayed rather than defeated, and Eleanor understood well enough that a man who had spent 10 years assuming an inheritance would not surrender it after a single setback, however public. But for the first time since the forged letter had appeared on Charlotte's trembling hands, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone, and that certainty, fragile as it still felt, was enough to carry her through the darkness of the ride home, and into whatever waited beyond it. The stable boy found the torn scrap of paper wedged beneath a saddle 3 days after the Ashworth gathering, and nearly threw it away before some small instinct made him carry it instead to Henry, the old steward, who recognized enough of the handwriting to bring it straight to Hartwell. Eleanor spread the fragment across the parlor table, her heart quickening as she studied the familiar, careful strokes. It was not the forged letter itself, but a partial draft, crossed out and abandoned, the same false confession about pursuing Alexander for his fortune, written in a hand that mimicked her own script closely, though not quite perfectly enough to fool someone who knew precisely what to look for. "This did not come from Frederick's own hand," Alexander said, examining the fragment when he arrived that afternoon. "Frederick has never been skilled with a pen. He would have needed someone else to produce a forgery this convincing. Someone who had access to my actual letters, to study my hand closely enough to copy it," Eleanor said, the realization settling cold in her stomach. "Someone close enough to Hartwell to obtain a sample without my noticing it missing." They sat with that unsettling thought for a long moment before Charlotte, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, spoke up with sudden certainty. "The tutor," she said, "Mr. Price, who came to give lessons in penmanship and French before father died. He kept several of your practice letters, Eleanor, as examples of proper hand. I remember you complaining that he never returned them." Eleanor's breath caught. She had nearly forgotten about the old letters, mundane practice exercises copied out years ago under her father's insistence that a lady's hand ought to be elegant as well as legible. She had not thought of Mr. Price in years, had assumed him retired or moved on to other households entirely. "Do you know where he settled, after he left our employ?" Alexander asked. "I do not," Eleanor admitted, "but Henry might. Father kept careful records of every servant and tutor who passed through Hartwell, for reference purposes. Henry, when consulted, confirmed that Mr. Price had taken a position several years earlier at a household not far from Ashworth itself, a household, as it happened, that belonged to a distant relation of Frederick Vane's mother. The connection was not proof on its own, but it was enough of a thread to begin pulling, and Alexander wasted no time in following it. He rode out the following morning, accompanied by his own solicitor, a careful man named George Whitfield who had served the Ashworth family for 2 decades, and possessed both the discretion and the legal knowledge the situation demanded. Eleanor waited at Hartwell through the long hours of that day, unable to settle to any task, her mind circling endlessly through possibilities she could not control from so great a distance. Alexander returned near dusk, his expression carrying a grim satisfaction that told Eleanor before he spoke a single word that they had found what they were looking for. Mr. Price confessed within the hour, Alexander said, settling heavily into the parlor chair as Eleanor poured him tea with hands that had not quite stopped trembling since morning. Frederick approached him 3 weeks ago, offering a considerable sum for a sample of forged correspondence, using your old practice letters as reference. Price claims he did not fully understand the purpose at the time, believed it some private jest between cousins, until the forged letter began circulating, and he realized what he had truly been party to. Will he testify to it? Eleanor asked, her voice tight with a hope she did not yet fully trust. He has already given a written statement to Whitfield, sworn and witnessed, Alexander said. Frederick's involvement is no longer merely suspected, Eleanor. It is proven, in his own tutor's confession and in payment records Whitfield discovered within Price's own accounts, clearly traceable back to Frederick's bank. Relief flooded through Eleanor so suddenly that she had to sit down, the weeks of accumulated fear and careful composure finally breaking loose all at once. Charlotte, who had been listening from the doorway once more, let out a sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and crossed the room to embrace her sister tightly. "It is over," Charlotte said. "Eleanor, it is finally over." "Not entirely," Alexander cautioned, though his own relief was evident beneath the careful words. "Frederick does not yet know we have this proof. I intend to confront him directly, before word spreads further, and give him the chance to answer for what he has done before witnesses of my choosing rather than the county's." The confrontation took place 2 days later, in the formal study of Ashworth Hall, with Whitfield present alongside Eleanor, who had insisted on attending despite Alexander's initial reluctance to expose her further to Frederick's presence. "I would rather face him directly," Eleanor had told him, "than hide at Hartwell while others decide my vindication on my behalf. I have spent enough years being spoken about instead of spoken to. I do not intend to start that pattern again now." Alexander had relented, and now Eleanor sat quietly in the corner of the study as Frederick was shown in, his usual easy charm faltering the moment he registered the gathered faces waiting for him. "Alexander," Frederick said carefully, "I was not aware this was to be a formal meeting." "Sit down, Frederick," Alexander said, his voice cold in a way Eleanor had not yet heard from him. "We have much to discuss." Whitfield laid out the evidence methodically, the tutor's signed confession, the traceable payment records, the fragment of the abandoned draft found in the Hartwell stables. Frederick's composure cracked steadily with each piece presented, his practiced charm giving way first to indignant denial, then to a brittle, desperate silence, as the weight of proof became undeniable even to him. "I did what I believed necessary," Frederick finally said, his voice stripped of all its earlier smoothness. "You cannot understand what it is to spend a decade believing an inheritance secure, only to watch it threatened by a woman no one had ever considered a serious match. I was protecting what was rightfully mine." "Nothing was ever rightfully yours, Frederick," Alexander said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable finality. "The title was never guaranteed to pass to you. It was simply convenient for you to believe so, and convenient beliefs do not entitle a man to destroy someone else's reputation to protect them." "What do you intend to do?" Frederick asked, and for the first time since Eleanor had known him, genuine fear crept into his voice. "I intend to make certain every person who read that forged letter learns the truth of who wrote it," Alexander said. "I intend to see Mr. Price's confession made public alongside your payment to him, and I intend to formally remove you from any future claim to this title, a decision well within my power to make, and one I should have considered long before your schemes forced my hand." Frederick's protests continued for several more minutes, alternating between anger and pleading, but Alexander remained unmoved, and eventually Frederick left the study a broken man, his careful decade of assumed inheritance dismantled in a single afternoon by evidence he had never expected anyone to find. Frederick left Ashworth Hall that same evening, his belongings packed hastily by servants who no longer troubled to hide their disapproval of him. Alexander did not see him off personally, having said everything he intended to say within the study. But Eleanor watched from an upper window as Frederick's carriage disappeared down the long drive, carrying him toward whatever diminished future awaited a man who had spent a decade building his life on an inheritance now permanently closed to him. She felt no triumph in watching him go, only a quiet, tired relief that the danger had finally passed. Charlotte joined her at the window, slipping an arm through Eleanor's. "Do you think he understood, even at the end, how much harm he caused?" Charlotte asked. "I do not know," Eleanor admitted. "I think men like Frederick rarely see the harm they cause as harm at all. They see only what they believe they are owed, and everything else becomes simply an obstacle to remove." They stood together at the window until the carriage vanished entirely from view, and then returned to the warmth of the gathering below, where word of the confrontation had already begun circulating among the remaining guests in careful, astonished whispers. Eleanor's mother, when she learned the full truth 2 days later, wept openly in a way Eleanor had rarely witnessed, relief and vindication mingling with the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 15 years worrying over her eldest daughter's uncertain future. "I always believed you deserved better than what this county offered you," her mother said, holding Eleanor's hands tightly across the small parlor table. "I only feared I would not live to see you receive it." "You will see a great deal more than that, Mother," Eleanor said gently, though she did not yet share the full extent of what Alexander had begun to discuss with her privately, unwilling to build her mother's hopes any higher until matters were properly settled. Henry, the old steward, offered his own quiet congratulations a few days later, his weathered face creased with genuine pleasure, as he helped Eleanor into the carriage for her next visit to Ashworth. "Your father would be proud, Miss Hartley, to see how you have managed all of this. Prouder, perhaps, than he ever managed to say while he lived." Eleanor carried those words with her throughout the following days, a quiet comfort against the last lingering echoes of 15 years spent believing herself unworthy of the very things now finally arriving. Whitfield advised that formal charges of forgery could be brought against both Frederick and Mr. Price, should Alexander wish to pursue the matter through the courts rather than settle it privately within the family. Alexander considered the option carefully, weighing the satisfaction of a public trial against the further scandal it would inevitably attach to Eleanor's name regardless of the outcome. "I would rather see the truth known and the matter closed quietly," Alexander finally decided, "than drag Eleanor through months of court proceedings simply to satisfy my own anger at what Frederick attempted. His removal from the succession is punishment enough, and a public trial would cost her more than it would cost him." Eleanor, when consulted, agreed readily. She had spent enough of her life as the subject of public speculation, and had no wish to extend that scrutiny further, however justified the cause. Mr. Price's written confession was read aloud before the county magistrate, a formal proceeding that Alexander insisted upon to ensure no lingering doubt remained about the letter's origin. The tutor, stripped of his position and facing considerable disgrace of his own for accepting Frederick's payment, offered no further defense, and the matter was formally closed within a fortnight. Eleanor's name cleared as thoroughly and publicly as it had once been dragged through scandal. The truth spread through the county with the same speed the forged letter itself had once traveled, though this time carrying vindication rather than scandal. Mrs. Colby, who had so eagerly recited the false letter at the Pembertons, found herself the subject of considerably less flattering gossip when her role in spreading it became common knowledge. Lady Amherst's stiff apology transformed, almost overnight, into genuine warmth, the sort of easy welcome Eleanor had spent 15 years watching other women receive without ever expecting it herself. But it was the quiet evening that followed, once the confrontation and its aftermath had finally settled, that mattered most to Eleanor. She and Alexander walked together through the Ashworth Gardens, the same path where he had first told her the truth of his engagement to Margaret Ellsworth, and this time it was his turn to speak of things he had carried carefully guarded for years. "I did not leave England only to manage properties abroad," he admitted, as they walked slowly beneath the darkening sky. "I left because I did not know how to grieve Margaret in a place full of people who expected me to simply move forward, to marry quickly, and secure the succession, as though love were a matter of practical necessity rather than genuine loss. I told myself, for 10 years, that I had simply lost interest in courtship. The truth was that I was afraid of losing someone again, afraid enough that avoiding attachment felt safer than risking it." "What changed?" Eleanor asked softly. "You did," Alexander said, stopping to face her fully. "That first night at the ball, you were the only person in the room not performing some version of themselves designed to please me. You were simply yourself, guarded and honest, and entirely unwilling to pretend otherwise. And I found I had not felt that particular kind of recognition in a decade. It frightened me at first, how quickly I wanted to know you better. but watching Frederick nearly destroy you these past weeks taught me something I should have already understood. The fear of loss is not a reason to avoid loving someone. It is simply the cost of loving them at all, and I find, having weighed that cost carefully, that I want to pay it, for the rest of my life, if you are still willing to have me." Eleanor stood quietly for a long moment, feeling the last of her own careful guardedness finally give way entirely. 15 years of invisibility, 8 years of Edmund's abandonment, weeks of Frederick's cruel schemes, all of it had taught her to expect disappointment as the natural conclusion of any hope she allowed herself. But standing in the quiet garden with a man who had just laid his own fears as openly before her as she had once laid hers before him, Eleanor understood, with a certainty she had not felt in longer than she could remember, that this particular hope was not going to disappoint her. "I am still willing," she said, echoing the words once more, though this time they carried the full weight of everything they had endured together to arrive at this exact moment. "I have been willing, I think, since that very first dance. I was simply too afraid to admit it, even to myself." Alexander drew her hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then let us be afraid together, Eleanor Hartley, and see what comes of it regardless." Behind them, the lights of Ashworth Hall glowed warm against the darkening evening, and somewhere inside those walls, word of Frederick's disgrace and Mr. Price's confession continued spreading among the guests still gathered for the evening, carrying with it the final unraveling of every cruel whisper that had followed Eleanor for 15 long years. She did not think of them now, standing in the quiet garden with her hand held gently in Alexander's. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor Hartley was not thinking of what the whispers said about her at all. She was simply present, entirely and finally, in a moment she had once believed she would never be given the chance to have. Charlotte found her sister an hour later, still lingering near the garden's edge, and did not need to ask what had passed between Eleanor and the Duke to see the change written plainly across her sister's face. "You look different," Charlotte said softly, studying her. "I feel different," Eleanor admitted, "as though I have set down something heavy that I carried for so long I had forgotten it was even possible to walk without it." "Good," Charlotte said, squeezing her hand. "You have carried enough for both of us these past months. Let someone else help carry it now." Eleanor smiled, the expression easier and less guarded than any smile she had offered a ballroom in 15 years. Somewhere behind them, the Ashworth household continued its quiet evening business, unaware that the woman once dismissed as the county's plain spinster had just been offered, in the truest sense of the word, exactly the future everyone had once assured her she would never have. The invitations went out 3 weeks later, thick cream paper stamped with the Ashworth crest, announcing a ball to open the new season at Ashworth Hall, and by the time they reached every household in the county, the truth had already spread far enough that no one needed to guess what the evening truly intended to celebrate. Eleanor stood before her bedroom mirror at Hartwell, her mother fussing over the final pins in her hair, while Charlotte adjusted the fall of her gown, a deep blue silk that Alexander had quietly arranged to have made for her, insisting it was simply a gift between friends, until Eleanor had stopped pretending she believed that explanation. "You look beautiful," her mother said, her voice thick with an emotion she had stopped trying to hide these past weeks. "I only wish your father had lived to see this. He would have liked Alexander," Eleanor said softly. "He always said a man's character mattered more than his fortune. I think he would have been glad to see I finally found someone who proved him right." Charlotte, radiant in her own excitement, could barely stay still long enough to finish arranging Eleanor's gown. Her own courtship with a young gentleman named William Ashby, the baronet's son who had partnered her so often at balls, had blossomed considerably over the past months. Free now of the desperate urgency that had once shadowed it, William had proposed a fortnight earlier, and Charlotte's answer had needed no consideration at all. "Tonight feels like the beginning of everything," Charlotte said, squeezing her sister's hand. "For both of us." The carriage ride to Ashworth Hall passed in a blur of quiet anticipation, and when Eleanor finally stepped through the grand doors into the ballroom that had once witnessed her 15 years of careful invisibility, she found herself, for the first time in her life, greeted not by whispers but by genuine warmth. Guests who had once looked past her now inclined their heads with respect. Women who had once mocked her quiet dignity now offered smiles that seemed, if not entirely sincere, at least carefully polite enough to matter. Alexander found her within minutes of her arrival, dressed in formal black that suited his steady stillness, exactly as it had the very first night they met. He bowed over her hand with the same unhurried courtesy he had shown her from the beginning, though his eyes carried something warmer now, something that had grown steadily over the months since that first unexpected dance. "You look remarkable," he said quietly, for her ears alone. You say that every time you see me, Eleanor said, though she had stopped doubting the sincerity behind it weeks ago. Because it remains true every time, Alexander said simply. The orchestra began to play, and Alexander led her onto the same dance floor where their story had begun, the entire room falling into the same hushed attention it had shown that very first night, though the quality of the silence had changed entirely. There was no cruelty in it now, no anticipation of scandal or humiliation. There was only the quiet fascination of a room watching two people who had clearly, undeniably, found something worth watching. Halfway through the dance, the music slowed unexpectedly, the orchestra shifting into a different arrangement Eleanor did not recognize, and she glanced toward Alexander with a question in her eyes that he answered by simply stopping, right there in the center of the crowded floor, and lowering himself onto one knee before her. The room's collective gasp was audible even over the quieted music. "Eleanor Hartley," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the hundreds of eyes now fixed entirely upon them. "I have spent 10 years believing myself content to live without the particular risk that comes with loving someone fully. I did not understand, until I met you, that I had simply been waiting for the right person to make that risk feel worth taking. You have shown me more honesty in a single dance than I found in a decade of careful distance, more courage in the face of cruelty than most people manage in a lifetime, and more grace than any of us in this room, myself included, truly deserve to witness. I would be honored, more than I can properly express, if you would consent to be my wife." Eleanor looked down at him, at the steady gray eyes that had first caught hers across this very room months ago, and felt 15 years of careful guardedness dissolve entirely into something warm and certain and utterly unafraid. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clearly enough for the watching room to hear. "Yes, I will." The ballroom erupted into applause, genuine this time, warm and unrestrained, and Alexander rose to draw her into an embrace that would have scandalized the very same room 15 years earlier, though tonight it drew only delighted approval from the assembled guests. Eleanor caught sight of her mother weeping openly with joy near the refreshment table, of Charlotte clapping with tears streaming freely down her own face, of even the previously scornful Mrs. Colby joining the applause with what appeared to be genuine warmth. In the weeks between the proposal and the wedding, Eleanor found herself navigating a county suddenly eager for her company, in a way that still felt, at times, disorienting after 15 years of quiet dismissal. Invitations arrived daily, far more than Hartwell had received in all the years since her father's death combined, and Eleanor accepted only those she believed genuine, declining the rest with a politeness that surprised no one who had watched her endure the county's cruelty with the same steady grace. Mrs. Colby, in one particularly awkward encounter at the milliner's shop, attempted an apology so thoroughly wrapped in excuses that it barely qualified as one at all. "I am sure you understand, Miss Hartley, how difficult it is to know what to believe when a letter appears so convincing." "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Colby," Eleanor replied evenly. "I understand that it was easier to believe cruelty of a woman you had already decided was unremarkable, than to extend her the same doubt you would have offered someone you respected from the start. I hope, in future, you will remember how quickly convenient belief can cause real harm." Mrs. Colby had no ready answer for that, and Eleanor left the shop without waiting for one, Charlotte hurrying to catch up with her outside, grinning despite herself. "You have grown rather fearless," Charlotte observed. "I have simply stopped pretending that politeness requires silence," Eleanor said. "I spent 15 years believing the two were the same thing. I no longer do." News of Frederick reached them only rarely in those weeks, second-hand through Whitfield, who maintained a professional awareness of the family's remaining obligations, even after Frederick's disgrace. He had retreated to a distant property inherited from his mother's side of the family, his reputation too damaged within their own county to remain, his prospects considerably diminished by the scandal his own scheming had ultimately caused. Eleanor felt little beyond a distant, weary pity when she thought of him at all, understanding that whatever bitterness had driven him to such lengths would likely follow him regardless of where he settled. Alexander, for his part, spent those weeks dividing his time between wedding preparations and the quiet, steady work of restoring Ashworth's tenant farms to the standard his father had once maintained. Work Eleanor found herself drawn into as naturally as she had once tended her own small garden bed. She rode the estate boundaries with him, reviewed accounts alongside Whitfield, and offered suggestions born of her own years managing Hartwell's failing finances that Alexander received not with condescension, as she had half expected, but with genuine gratitude. "You understand land in a way most people of your station never bother to learn," Alexander told her one afternoon, as they walked the boundary of a newly restored field. "I confess, I find myself relying on your judgment more than I expected to when I first asked you to dance. I have had considerable practice, Eleanor said, in making very little stretch very far. It seems a shame to abandon that skill entirely, simply because I will no longer need it out of necessity. Then do not abandon it, Alexander said. Ashworth will be the better for your attention, I have no doubt. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, in the small stone church at the edge of Hartwell's own land, chosen deliberately by Eleanor over the grander cathedral in town, because she wanted her father's memory present in the same ground where he had once walked, and because she had spent enough of her life performing for grand audiences and wanted, on this particular day, only the people who truly mattered to witness her joy. Charlotte stood beside her as her attendant, radiant in her own upcoming engagement to William Ashby, and Eleanor's mother sat in the front pew, weeping happily through the entire ceremony, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief that had long since stopped being useful for its intended purpose. Henry, the old steward who had served Hartwell faithfully through its hardest years, stood near the back of the small church, beaming with the particular pride of a man who had watched a difficult story finally arrive at the ending it deserved. Alexander waited for her at the altar, his expression carrying none of the practiced stillness Eleanor had first met at that long-ago ball, replaced instead by an openness she had grown to treasure over the months of their courtship. When she reached him, he took her hands in his and spoke the vows in a voice steady with certainty, and Eleanor found her own voice equally sure as she answered him in kind. 33 years of quiet waiting finally arriving at the moment she had once believed would never come. The wedding breakfast that followed filled Hartwell's aging halls with more warmth and laughter than the estate had known in years, and Eleanor moved through the gathering not as the overlooked eldest daughter she had once been, but as a woman finally, fully seen, surrounded by people who had learned, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, exactly what they had spent 15 years failing to notice. William Ashby raised the first toast of the afternoon, his voice warm with genuine affection as he spoke of watching Eleanor support Charlotte through countless seasons without ever once complaining of her own quiet exclusion. I do not think any of us truly understood, until recently, the depth of patience it must have taken, he said, raising his glass toward her, to stand at the edge of so many rooms and never once let bitterness take root. Alexander is a fortunate man, and I suspect he knows it better than any of us. Charlotte spoke next, her voice unsteady with emotion as she described growing up in her elder sister's shadow, not the shadow of resentment but of quiet protection. Years of Eleanor stepping aside so Charlotte might shine a little brighter at every gathering they attended together. She gave up her own seasons for mine more times than I can count, Charlotte said, and never once asked for anything in return. I am only glad the world has finally caught up to what I always knew about her. Eleanor's mother, too overcome to manage a proper toast, simply embraced her daughter tightly amid the gathered guests, murmuring words meant only for Eleanor's ears about her father's pride and her own long years of quiet worry finally, mercifully, laid to rest. The afternoon stretched into early evening with dancing in the newly refreshed ballroom, funded in part by Alexander's quiet insistence that Hartwell's remaining debts be settled as a wedding gift to Eleanor's mother, a gesture Eleanor had initially resisted before recognizing it for the genuine kindness it was rather than any attempt to purchase her family's gratitude. Tenants who had worked Hartwell's land for decades mingled easily with county gentry, who had once looked past Eleanor entirely, and Eleanor found herself, more than once during the celebration, simply pausing to watch the warmth filling rooms that had known so much quiet struggle in the years since her father's death. Later that evening, as the celebrations began winding toward their close, Eleanor found a quiet moment alone with Alexander, near the same small garden bed she had once tended by herself, back when Hartwell could afford no proper gardener, and pride had mattered less to her than practicality. "Do you remember what you told me, the first time you saw this garden?" she asked, settling beside him on the old stone bench her father had installed decades earlier. "I told you it showed," Alexander said, "that you tended it yourself. I remember thinking, even then, that it told me more about your character than any introduction in that ballroom ever could have." "I have been thinking," Eleanor said, "that I would like to keep tending it, even as Duchess of Ashworth. Not because Hartwell needs it any longer, but because I do not wish to forget where I came from, or how long I waited for someone to see what was always there." Alexander took her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the same unhurried care he had shown from the very beginning. "Then we will tend it together, every season, for as long as you wish to remember." Above them, the last light of evening faded into a sky scattered with early stars, and somewhere behind them, the sounds of the wedding celebration continued softly into the night, warm and unhurried, exactly as their own story had unfolded. Eleanor Hartley, once dismissed by an entire county as the plain spinster no one would ever choose, sat quietly beside the man who had chosen her anyway, fully and without reservation, and understood, with a certainty that had taken 33 long years to arrive, that some of the best things in life come not to those who chase them loudest, but to those patient and honest enough to still be standing, unbroken and unashamed, when the right person finally, truly looks their way. In the months that followed, word of their story traveled well beyond the county that had once whispered so cruelly about Eleanor's unmarried years. Young women who had spent seasons feeling overlooked found themselves quietly encouraged by her example. And Eleanor, now Duchess of Ashworth, made a point of welcoming such women into her circle, rather than allowing the same cruel dismissals she had once endured to continue unchallenged in rooms she now had the standing to influence. It was not a grand crusade, nor did she intend it as one. It was simply the quiet, steady kindness of a woman who remembered exactly what it felt like to stand unseen at the edge of every room, and who had decided, now that she finally stood at its center, that no one else deserving of notice would have to wait 15 years to receive it. Charlotte's own wedding followed less than a year later, a bright, lively celebration far less shadowed by scandal than Eleanor's own journey had been, and Eleanor stood beside her sister at the altar with the same quiet pride Charlotte had once shown her. Their mother, finally free of the anxious weight she had carried through so many uncertain years, spent her remaining seasons dividing her time contentedly between both daughters' households, delighting in a peace she had once feared she would never live to see. Eleanor never forgot the years she had spent unseen, nor did she wish to. They had shaped the quiet strength that had, in the end, drawn Alexander to her in the first place, and she carried them forward not as wounds but as proof of exactly how far patience and honesty could carry a person, even through 15 long years of being told they were worth nothing at all. 2 years into her marriage, Eleanor stood at the window of Ashworth Hall's east wing, watching a carriage she did not recognize make its slow way up the long drive, and felt an old, familiar wariness stir in her chest before she reminded herself, gently, that she no longer needed to brace herself for every unexpected arrival. The carriage belonged to a young woman named Sophie Barlow, a distant cousin of Alexander's late mother, who had written ahead requesting a private audience with the Duchess regarding a matter she described only as delicate. Eleanor received her in the small parlor she had claimed as her own since arriving at Ashworth, a room furnished simply, without the excessive formality of the grander receiving rooms, because Eleanor had never quite lost her preference for comfort over display. Sophie arrived pale and visibly nervous, twisting her gloves in her lap as she explained her circumstance. She was 26, unmarried, and had spent the last several seasons enduring the same quiet dismissal Eleanor herself remembered too well. Whispered comparisons to younger, prettier cousins, polite refusals from families who considered her prospects too poor to be worth serious consideration. "I do not know why I came," Sophie admitted, her voice unsteady. "Only that everyone speaks of you as someone who understands what it is to be overlooked, and I find I have nowhere else to turn for honest counsel." Eleanor recognized, immediately and completely, the particular exhaustion behind Sophie's carefully composed words, the exhaustion of a woman who had spent years performing contentment she did not feel, smiling through rooms that offered her nothing but polite indifference in return. "You came to the right place," Eleanor said gently. "Tell me everything, and I will tell you honestly what I believe, without the flattery this county so often prefers over truth." Sophie's story unfolded slowly over the following hour, familiar in its broad shape though different in its particular details. A family in reduced circumstances, a younger sister more easily admired, a string of seasons that had yielded nothing but disappointment and increasingly cruel commentary from women who considered themselves her betters. Eleanor listened without interruption, recognizing in Sophie's careful, guarded composure the same walls she herself had built over 15 long years. "I cannot promise you a duke will walk into your life and change everything in a single evening," Eleanor said finally, when Sophie had finished. "That would be a foolish promise, and I have never cared for foolish promises. But I can promise you that the version of yourself worth knowing does not depend on whether this county chooses to notice it. I spent 15 years believing otherwise, and every one of those years was wasted believing a lie." "How did you survive it?" Sophie asked. "The waiting, I mean, the not knowing whether it would ever change." Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering, aware that whatever she said now would carry weight for a young woman clearly starved of honest guidance. "I kept tending what was mine to tend," she said finally. "My sister's happiness, my mother's peace, a small garden bed no one else cared to notice. I did not wait for the world to see me before I decided my own life was worth living carefully and honestly. The recognition came eventually, but it was never the thing that made those years bearable. What made them bearable was refusing to let cruelty convince me I was as small as it insisted I was." Sophie left Ashworth that afternoon with considerably more color in her cheeks than she had arrived with, and Eleanor found herself, in the weeks that followed, extending similar invitations to other young women the county had quietly dismissed, not out of any grand design but simply because she remembered too clearly what it felt like to have no one offer such honesty in return. Alexander noticed the pattern before she had fully articulated it even to herself, finding her one evening reviewing a small stack of correspondence from women she had never met before this past year, each letter thanking her for counsel offered during a brief visit or a longer stay. "You are building something here," he observed, settling beside her with the particular quiet attentiveness she had come to treasure in their evenings together. "Whether you intend it or not, I am simply doing what I wish someone had done for me," Eleanor said. 15 years is a long time to wait for someone to see you clearly. I would rather other women wait considerably less, if I can help it." Their own household in those 2 years had settled into a rhythm Eleanor had once believed impossible for herself, mornings spent reviewing estate accounts alongside Alexander, afternoons divided between the tenant farms she had grown genuinely fond of managing and the small garden she still tended personally despite Ashworth's ample staff of gardeners, evenings spent in quiet conversation that never seemed to run short of things worth discussing. Charlotte visited often, her own marriage to William Ashby settling into a comfortable happiness free of the desperate urgency that had once shadowed her prospects, and their mother divided her remaining years contentedly between both daughters, finally free of the anxious weight she had carried through decades of uncertain finances and quiet worry over Eleanor's unmarried future. Frederick's name arose only rarely, mentioned in passing through occasional correspondence Whitfield still maintained regarding the family's remaining legal obligations. He had settled quietly on his mother's inherited property, his reputation too diminished within their own circles to attempt any return, his ambitions reduced to whatever modest comfort remained available to a man who had gambled his future on a scheme that ultimately cost him everything he had hoped to gain. Eleanor felt, when she thought of him at all, only a distant and increasingly faint echo of the fear he had once inspired, replaced almost entirely by the settled certainty of a life built on truth, rather than the cruel fictions he had once tried to construct against her. It was on a quiet evening in early autumn, nearly 2 years to the day since that first unexpected dance, that Eleanor found herself once again standing at the edge of the very ballroom where her story had begun, watching a new season's gathering unfold before her with none of the old dread that had once accompanied every such evening. A young woman stood alone near the same pillar Eleanor herself had once claimed as her permanent post, watching the dancing with the particular careful stillness of someone who had already resigned herself to another evening of quiet invisibility. Eleanor recognized the posture immediately, the straight spine that cost more effort than it appeared to, the practiced calm that hid years of accumulated disappointment beneath its surface. She crossed the room without hesitation, the 15 years of her own hesitation long since replaced by a confidence that had taken considerable time and considerable cost to build. "You look as though you could use better company than that pillar," Eleanor said, offering the young woman a warm smile. The girl startled, clearly unaccustomed to such direct attention from anyone of consequence. "Your Grace, I did not mean to intrude upon your evening." "You are not intruding," Eleanor said. "I remember standing exactly where you are standing now, for longer than I care to admit. I promise you, the view improves considerably once someone finally bothers to look properly." As if summoned by the observation itself, Alexander appeared at Eleanor's side, offering the young woman a courteous bow before turning his attention warmly to his wife. "I believe this dance is meant to be mine, Duchess," he said, extending his hand. Eleanor accepted it with the same easy certainty that had grown between them over 2 years of marriage, though before allowing him to lead her toward the floor, she turned back to the young woman still standing near the pillar. "Do not let this room convince you of anything false about your own worth," Eleanor said gently. "I promise you, it very often lies." She left the young woman considering those words with an expression Eleanor recognized easily, the first small crack in years of carefully constructed resignation, and allowed Alexander to lead her onto the dance floor where their own story had first begun. The music rose warm and familiar around them, and Eleanor moved through the steps with the easy grace of a woman who no longer needed to brace herself against disappointment, who had learned, through every difficult turn of the past several years, that patience honestly kept was never truly wasted, however long it took the world to finally notice what had been worth seeing all along. Later that night, as their carriage carried them home beneath a sky scattered thick with stars, Alexander took her hand in the quiet dark, much as he had done in the Ashworth Gardens on the evening Frederick's scheme had finally been undone. "Do you ever think of that first ball?" he asked. "The girl standing at the pillar tonight reminded me of it rather strongly." "I think of it often," Eleanor admitted, "though it feels, now, like a story that happened to someone else entirely." I do not think that girl at the pillar tonight would recognize the woman I have become, any more than I recognized, that first evening, the woman I was capable of becoming. I recognized her, Alexander said quietly. From the very first moment I saw you standing there, I simply had to wait for the rest of the world to catch up to what I already knew. Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder as the carriage carried them onward through the dark countryside, past the same fields and hedgerows that had once witnessed 15 long years of quiet waiting, and felt, with a certainty that no longer needed proving to herself or to anyone else, that whatever seasons still lay ahead of her, she would meet them exactly as she was, finally and completely seen, by the one person whose seeing had ever truly mattered. The following spring brought word that Sophie Barlow, the young woman who had once arrived at Ashworth pale and uncertain, had accepted a proposal from a modest but kind gentleman farmer she had met, quite by accident, at a small gathering Eleanor had encouraged her to attend rather than avoid. Sophie's letter announcing the engagement carried none of the desperate relief Eleanor might once have expected from a woman finally escaping years of quiet dismissal. Instead, it carried a steady, contented joy, the joy of someone who had stopped waiting to be chosen and had simply continued living honestly until the right person noticed exactly that. Eleanor read the letter aloud to Alexander over breakfast, smiling at the news with the particular satisfaction of watching a small kindness bear fruit she had never demanded credit for offering. "You have started something," Alexander observed, not for the first time, "that I do not think you can easily stop now, even if you wish to." "I do not wish to stop it," Eleanor said simply. "I spent too many years believing my own story would end quietly, unremarked and unremembered. I find I would rather spend the years I have left making certain other women are not left waiting so long to learn otherwise." Outside the breakfast room window, the Ashworth gardens stretched toward the pale morning light, the same careful beds Eleanor had continued tending herself despite every offer of additional help, a small, deliberate reminder of exactly where her story had begun, and everything it had grown to become since. She had spent 15 years believing herself invisible in rooms full of people too careless to look properly. She spent her years now making certain that invisibility, wherever she found it in others, did not go unanswered nearly so long again.